Hey everybody, welcome to this week's edition of CanJS Community Hangout. Um, this week we are going to hear from Alfredo. And Alfredo, I'm going to go and let you introduce yourself real fast and tell us what it is you're going to be showing us.
Okay, I'm going to be going over how to set up A/B testing in about 20 minutes using some APIs from Google and can.Components.
Cool. And so the idea, you were telling me a little bit about this before, but so the idea is that you're taking Google Analytics, putting in can.Component, that we can easily wrap A/B tests. So
yeah, I'll go into go into the point of A/B testing and an example test and go over what the point is and what parts are reusable by using can.Components.
Awesome. It sounds like we have a very well put together presentation for today. And then I'm just going to introduce our commentator real fast. Hey Matt, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going, Chris? That is Chris, right?
It was. And then Brian, who seems very accessory free today.
Not in the spirit. Oh, yeah.
Oh, we can't hear you, Brian. You seem to be muted.
You need to shout through it so we can hear you.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
This is the cone of shame hat. Since I can't put it over my head.
You're not supposed to
Alfredo, is that the jQuery logo on your head?
Me?
Alfredo.
No, it's a power dome.
It looks like the old jQuery logo,
Oh.
with like stacked cups.
Okay. Without further ado, go ahead, Alfredo. I'm excited to see this presentation. So.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Happy Halloween to everybody from the CanJS community in Batovi. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Alfredo.
Okay, so I should be sharing my screen with my one slide. So
Nice
okay,
picture.
so thanks. So what's the point of the content experiments that we're talking about today? Let's say that you're in a situation where you have competing ideas that seem equally beneficial. Like you're not sure if your users will respond any differently to a buy now prompt versus a purchase today prompt. You're not left with flipping the coin and wondering what might have been. It's possible to launch both of these variations and conditionally display them to different groups of users, and then you can see if there was any significant difference in how each of these variations performed. Today we're going to be using Google Analytics content experiments as our backend for the testing. And the reason why we're doing that is because, or the reason why I chose this particular API over a separate service is that when I was initially working on it, Google Analytics was already part of the site, and it's very likely that most sites that people are working on are likely to have Google Analytics, and if that's the case, then there's no immediate need to add an additional service. It comes with two APIs. One of them is the content experiment API, which is very straightforward and simple, and that's what we'll mostly be covering today. And then there's a more advanced management API that gives you much greater control, and with that control you can build your own management interface or incorporate it into a CMS or some larger system without having to always go to the Google Analytics interface to perform administration. So this solution gives you room to grow, and it's flexible so that if you decide that maybe you don't like Google's say their statistics engine and you'd rather have your own statistics engine, then you can set it to use your own, and you can kind of scale how much you want Google to do for you and how much you're willing to implement yourself. So it's flexible that way. And if it matters to management, Google Analytics is free, as in beer, and it's quick to set up. So are there any downsides to this service? These tools did originate in somewhat of a page-centric paradigm. So that is a drawback.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, like let's say that like a user would send in their request for a page, then at that point you would, like the server would make a call to figure out which variation they should be served, and they get redirected to a separate page that has that, or a separate version of that page that has the variation that you're trying to test. But that's not the way it's done anymore. You don't have to do it that way. Unfortunately, some of the administration interfaces that are still at Google Analytics haven't been keeping up with that. So we'll see when we set up an example experiment how in some places we have to put in some like bogus like URLs and things like that because it's assuming that your variation is a whole page instead of just a component. So what we're going to be doing is totally in the browser and it's asynchronous. As soon as the user comes to the page, we're going to piggyback, or the content experiments piggybacks on the rest of Google Analytics. So we'll have the ability to track that user. Then we can, when I said that we can scale how much Google does for us versus how much we do on our own, for the sake of expediency, I'm going to let Google do everything. So I'm going to ask Google to pick a variation for me using its statistics engine. And all I'm doing is I'm getting the answer, which is in this case, since we're doing A/B, there's really going to be the answer of 0 or 1 for the different variations. And if it's 0, we're going to evaluate that as A. If it's 1, we're going to evaluate that as B. Render some special content. Then we're going to let Google Analytics know that, hey, I just showed a variation, so please track this for me. Then with this data, it would be possible to track how users reacted to the variations and see if one group is more likely to respond positively to one of the variations that were shown to them. So with that, let me quickly change my screen and let's get into actually implementing this. Okay, so I'm not going to go over how you sign up for Google Analytics, but if you go to google.com Analytics, you can with your Google account, you can sign up for Google Analytics, and then you can you get a dashboard like this where you set up the sites that you can administer or view. If you were to click on this, let's say my test site, all website data, you would get something like the reporting page. If you click on admin, that would let you get to the tracking info, which is a little snippet of tracking of asynchronous JavaScript that basically loads the Google Analytics API along with your unique tracking code, and it registers that there was a page viewed. So that part you definitely have to. We're going to assume that you're already up to this point where you've already got Google Analytics set up and you've done this much. Then from there, we need to know whether a variation had some sort of positive outcome that we're looking for. It's possible to configure it for landing on a particular page or staying on the site a little longer. So you can do duration or destinations. There's quite a bit of metrics that you can set up for what designates the particular variation as having accomplished something positive that you're going to measure against the other variations to determine which one's the winning variation. So in this case, I'm going to keep it simple. I went to goals. I'm going to go to goals, and previously I went ahead and set up a goal called thank you, and basically it's a destination, and we're saying that that the destination has a URL of /ad/thankyou.html on this test site that we've set up. We can go ahead and set up a new goal just to go through the process, but you know, like I said, this was a destination. We give it a name. We can do other events like but we're just going to, we'll for this case, like I said, we're going to do a destination. And the next step for a destination is give a URL, and we're good. So once we have that goal, then we can go back to reporting. We can search for experiments, and then you get the experiments screen. If you've never set up an experiment, then you get a button that says Start Experiments. Otherwise, you just get a little breakdown of the experiments you have running and the ability to create a new one. So I'm going to go ahead and create an experiment just for the purpose of going through the process. First thing you do is give it a name. You set your metric. In this case, we're going to say that you reach thankyou.html. Then the next step is you set up your variations. And this is an example of where this interface is not keeping up with the times. It's expecting you to have fully qualified domain names and URLs leading to these different versions of the same page. Fortunately, you can just you're not stuck with using multiple pages, but you do have to fill this out. So one thing you can do is the variation, or the original variation is 0, so you can do like 0.com and say like original variation. And unfortunately, it's going to go ahead and try to validate 0.com, but it's bogus. So it's not going to be able to succeed, but it's not going to stop you from continuing. Then variation 1, we're going to say 1.com, and this is and by the way, this is where if you were kind of wrapping this into a more complicated system or trying to make it a more attractive product to an end user, the management API would allow you to bypass this entire process and implement your own interface for setting up experiments. So I'm going to say this is variation 1. I'm going to go to the next step, and then I'm going to manually. I need the experiment ID. So if you click on manually insert code, you'll see this snippet of code that we're not going to reuse today, but we have an experiment ID. And we don't need the experiment key. We just need the experiment ID. So if I click next step, it's going to warn me that like, oh, these pages that you set up are no good. So, but we can still go ahead and start the experiment, and it'll confirm, and then your experiment would start running. We are going to go ahead and discard this one because I've already set one up called Buy Now, Purchase Today. And if we were to go into it and edit settings, we'd see that you basically have 2 variations with the broken validator, and it has the experiment code that I was gonna need, that I mentioned earlier. So after this, once you save the changes and you have an experiment running, you're done with the Google API, with the Google setup part. Now we can go into the more interesting part, which is the code. So how do I go ahead and implement all of this stuff that I just went through and set up in the analytics? One way to do it, and I found this to be kind of useful, because not only can you wrap like text or images or something, you can if you wanted to wrap other components, is to by creating, and the way I accomplished that was by creating a content experiment component, and it's currently live at adelgado.org/ab. So we're going to play with it, but first let's go over the what it takes. The 100% of this implementation is basically on your screen right now with just a little bit of scrolling. On the top right, or I'm sorry, on the top left, we have the HTML for the index page, so basically we have our div for our app that we're going to render our app into. We have the Google Analytics synchronous snippet that we started the Google Analytics presentation with, that we would just copy and paste off of the admin. Then I'm loading jQuery. I'm loading CanJS. I'm loading my content experiment component, which is over on the right side of my screen. And then I got a little bootstrap script here that's going to take my index dash, which is on the bottom left, and I'm going to render it with this experiment ID that I copied off of the experiment configuration. And that is going to go to, and that's going to get, so that's going to end up getting passed into my component. Now the index dash, real quick, is down here on the right, on the bottom left. We've got the opening tag passing it the experiment ID. Then we're just using some stash helpers. So if A, we're going to render this version, which says buy now. If B, we're going to render the purchase today version. And you know, like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be a link or something, you know, like simple like this. You can do whatever you want here. You can add other components. You can do you can do a lot, whatever you can think of that you would conditionally show a user. You can do this. You can use this to wrap it. So then on the right side, let's go over the component. I'm starting off with the view model, using the define plugin to define some defaults, in particular the experiment ID. I'm defining it as having a type of a string. Variation, I'm setting a setter for it. I want it to either be numeric or undefined, and numeric and greater than 0, or otherwise I'm going to leave it as undefined. Then I just, it read nicer in the stash, so I went ahead and defined a property for A, which is basically a variation of 0. Then we have then we're in A. If variation is 1, then we're in B. And that's the end. That's it for the view model. Then the can.Component, where we define the tag as content experiment. We're passing the view model as its scope, and then in the events, we're going to do some loading of the content experiment API. We're passing the experiment ID as a parameter, and it's going to return back a script that is going to be ready for us to call methods on, such as content experiment API, choose variation. At this point, it's going to, like I said earlier, it piggybacks on the fact that Google Analytics is already being used, and so it's going to it knows which experiment is involved. It knows which variation is the next one that should go out. It knows which it knows to check if you've seen a particular variation before. So, because if you have, then we're going to show you the same variation. And then so we're setting in our scope the variation that comes back. So in this case, it's going to be 0, 1. And then the very next line is we're going to call in Google Analytics, and we're just going to be sending a non-interactive event, which basically means that something happened. It wasn't a page view, but we want Google Analytics to know that, like, hey, if whatever, the payload that was basically created by the fact that we chose a variation, we want you to be aware of that. So this next call is basically to make sure that that we phone home to Google to let them know that, like, this experiment was shown to this particular user. Well, yeah, because this is what lets you know that the variation was actually
used.
Was actually used, yeah, and it also, lets you start the tracking of, is this person going to actually do the positive goal that I've set for this variation, so that I can know if this variation is more productive than another one. So if you wanted to skip this step, what you could do is if you load the Google Analytics API after the Google Content Experiment API, then that initial page view would actually go ahead and take the payload from the content experiment. But then that means that you have to make sure that things are happening in the right order and whatnot. This is a lot more straightforward, where I'm just sending a non-interactive event to Google. I defined these things myself. I said it was an event, and my event is experiment, and the action on that was it was shown. So
hey, Alfredo, maybe I missed it, but what's the value of choose variation? Like, what does it return?
Well, in this case, it's going to be 0 or 1 because we only have 2 variations. So we got A. So that's why over here, like in the
what if you had more variations? What would it?
It's 0 index, so you'd have 0, 1, 2, 3, etc.
Just the index of whatever variation you've chosen. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, where does the CX API come from? Is that part of the script? Is that a global?
This I'm using
CX API.
I'm using script the get script from jQuery to load this URL.
No, he's asking about CX API.
Yeah, like I said, I'm using the jQuery get script right here in this line, which loads this URL to Google, that loads the CX API with your content experiment already passed in as a parameter.
But that object, that CX API object is part of the script. Is that a global?
It ends up being a global, just like Google Analytics is a like GA ends up being a global.
Okay.
Attached to window.
So what does it do if you? You might have. I'm sorry if I missed this part, but if you've got multiple experiments, do they overwrite the CX API, or how does that work?
Yes, but that's okay because you're only really interested in it living long enough for you to get a variation and then sending it another one. If you, if you wanted to, this, like I said, this is like I set this up to be like as quick as possible. It is, but CX API does actually have more methods than just choose variation. So if you wanted to, you could explicitly do things like set the chosen variation yourself, or use choose variation, then call a method called chosen variation when you pass it the variation that was just shown, and it'll either automatically assume that you meant the last one that was read in, or you can then also explicitly pass the experiment key, or the experiment ID that you just that you want to register that you saw a variation.
So in other words, this is not optimized for having multiple experiments. If you had multiple experiments, you'd probably just you'd arrange it differently so that you're loading the script once and choosing the variations from that were sent back in that script, right? So you wouldn't. This is for like if you have just quickly setting up one experiment at a page.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think you can get a lot of mileage of this, but there's other ways to go about it that would be just requires more work on your part. So,
Alfredo, one thing I'm thinking about this, the one thing I don't like about this is that it sets the value to either A or B. I mean that's fine for the simple case, but you want to have this to be a reusable component, right?
Mm-hmm.
So probably, all you really need to do is set the variation, and then your content can use that variation however it pleases. One thing I like about this sort of thing is this is basically a component that's not really a visual component at all. It's just running the script and getting the variation for you. And then the power of scope is your inner content can use that variation and it can do whatever it wants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely only using the user content that's being passed in as the content of that's being displayed through this component. I'm going to go ahead and show what the end result looks like. I'm going to go ahead and delete my cookies and reload this page. And in this particular instance, we've got the purchase today variation. If I reload a bunch, I'm still going to get the same one. If I try again, this time I got the the 0 version, and once again, I'll just keep getting that. So if I actually click through to this through this link, the next option or the next page that comes up is the thank you page. So in this case, this would be registered as a success for this particular variation, and that would mean that it would be added to the ranking of this particular variation, and see if it was if it did better than the other version.
You mentioned, like you've done an excellent job of showing how we can do this in a dynamic application. Can you do the same thing with the thank you? I mean, what if it was like they clicked on a button and it just did something inside of that control, that component, something that didn't actually redirect you anywhere?
Yeah, you could. If we go to the goals, if you notice, one of the goals, or one of the types of goals that we could implement was an event. I couldn't off the top of my head tell you what steps to do, but you can do things like, but the same way that I passed a non-interactive event to register that that I had shown the variation, you can go ahead and call GA with Google Analytics with an event such as I clicked on this link, and that would be registered against your goal.
Got it. I almost wonder if that's something that event could be passed in to your content experiment component somehow too, and tied in.
Yeah, like for example, what event to? Well, in that case, I would say that you wouldn't put it into the content experiment component, but if you can put it into whatever component you're wrapping. Is being wrapped by content experiments, so that if somebody clicks on say, let's say your component's a video player or something, it could be responsible for when you click on the play button that I'm going to send an event that that says the play button was clicked on or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It still seems like it'd be better if there's some way where you didn't have to. Like you mentioned before, if you had components, that's kind of what I'm thinking of. We had components inside of these stash helpers. That if there was some way we could pass in what that event is that should be fired, rather than having to programmatically put it into the components. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't wrap it into. I'm not sure. I just wouldn't put it into content experiment. I mean, it would still have to be the component that's doing the actual work. They would have to know what it is that its events are. I mean, you don't necessarily have to go ahead and have every component be aware of Google Analytics. You might have some other component whose job is to just send events to Google.
Well, this would be a great can-do adder as well. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would just set the variation as on the scope after it loaded, and then you could just use it however.
Well, we're talking about actual events that in the sense of let's say there was a video player, clicking on the play button, clicking pause, messing with the volume, scrubbing, or things like that. Those are all events that belong to that component. Now, that component doesn't necessarily have to be.
Belongs to which component?
Well, let's say there's a video player component.
Mm-hmm.
The events such as somebody clicked on my play button, somebody clicked on my pause button, somebody scrubbed, somebody messed with the volume or something. Those were, I would say, those are events that belong to that component, and it can just message out these things happen, and then something else could catch that these events and relay them over to Google. But at that point, I would see those as separate from the experiment. I would say that the content experiment is just there to set itself up, make sure you get the right variation that's being tracked, and then in the same way that go into a particular a particular page is then the job of Google Analytics, and content experiments is no longer like directly involved, I would say that sending back events such as like the play button was clicked would be something else's responsibility. So, but it could totally, but that's another situation where you could totally wrap the components to like listen for events or something, and then translate those into Google Analytic ease so that it can be used for goal tracking and things like that.
Yeah, no, there's a tough problem there, but I think it makes sense. I don't know how to implement it, but like you mentioned, the content experiment, it shows the two variations, but without the event being passed in of which one actually worked, it's all kind of pointless, right? We're just showing two variations. So if we can somehow, and I don't know the answer either, but somehow intelligently get that event, passed through, or like you said, kind of catch it or something. It's where it's built into the content experiment in some way.
Well, that's the thing. At that point, it's really not the content experiment has done its job. It's just a matter of at that point you're just doing regular tracking. And what ties the two things together is that when you configure your content experiment, you would say that my goal isn't I'm going to hit URL XYZ. My goal is that this event happens.
I see what you're saying.
And then,
okay.
So, yeah.
Awesome. I'll leave you alone on that.
Well, this is basically it.
You should already have everywhere in your application anyways, is what you're basically saying.
Yeah, Google Analytics, this is all piggybacking off of Google Analytics. So that's what's actually tracking the events and tracking the fact that, like, oh, I hit this page. When I went to thankyou.html, there's nothing in that page that knows anything about content experiments. But Google Analytics was aware that, like, hey, I showed this guy this variation, and now he's at this page that's a goal of this variation. So therefore, I should count this as a positive for that variation.
Very cool. I'll tell you, like, I know it wasn't the most exciting thing in the world to walk us all through, like, the actual setting up of the experiments and everything, but I'm really happy you did, because I've set these up for Dynamics before, and it is a pain the first time to do all the foundation work you did of figuring out how to set it up to ignore the errors. So I think anybody else that's actually going to do this and set up content experiments, they'll be very happy that you walked them through every step of it. So.
Yeah, and I think we basically made it in 20 minutes. So if you trim out some of the questions.
Hey, we should A/B test whether wearing weird outfits is going to improve our viewership.
So far, the signs look good. So we might become like the KISS of JavaScript conferences. Hey, Matt, have you done A/B tests before with, like, Google Analytics?
No, I've never actually done any. No.
So for you, did everything make sense, or is there any questions about how it all works?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my mind is more on the, like, how do we organize it in an app kind of stuff that you were talking about. It's interesting. You do, because I've been in a project where we did this kind of stuff, and where we did tracking specifically, and how you can kind of extract that into its own place where it doesn't interfere with the rest of your app. It's kind of a tough thing to figure out.
So. Awesome. Unless there's any questions, thanks a lot, Alfredo. Great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Happy Halloween, everybody. We'll see you next Friday. Next Friday is actually going to be the CanJS roadmap, too, where we're going to be talking a bit about the future, some new features that are coming in, things that have gotten done over the last month, and we'll have another presentation. So next week is going to be a little bit longer, but it's going to be awesome. We do it once a month, first Friday, so see you guys then, and yeah, it's good. Have fun. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Bye.
You love Alfredo.
Thanks.